were too high. We worked with the board. They wanted to see 3 options in October for moving forward to reduce at the lowest possible cost to provide the spaces at the Career Center and looking at the additional 450 secondary seats. And we worked through that. During the process, most of what we were looking at were additions and alterations to keep the costs down. The board wanted to see a new option, so we added a 4th option, so there are now 4 options. We did a work session with the board a couple of weeks ago, and their big concern was budget and cost of the project, as well as enrollment projections and do we need the additional seats, etc. So we have actually added 4 additional options which look at the possibility of the project with 450 fewer seats as the basis. So we essentially have 2 ed specs and we have 4 options for each of the ed specs. So we've been working since then with, or during that process, we started again writing the ed specs with our consultant. We moved into working through designs. We ended up with the estimators. We have 2 estimators that we've been working with, and they have been involved in the process of coming up with the options, as well as looking at the costs. And as far as the costs go, we are not only looking at construction costs, we're looking at phasing and how long that will extend the project depending on the option, which again adds the cost. So we looked at as much detail as we could. We're essentially looking at sketch plans. We are not looking at conceptual designs yet. The intent is that when we get through the board action, that they direct us to work on a concept design that will give us even more details by the time we get to the CIP in the spring and summer coming up. So Ben, I'll let you drive and take us through the presentation.
Thank you, Jeff. I will start by sharing my screen. And Jeff, can you confirm that the material's on the screen?
Yes, right now. Yep.
Excellent. Great. Thank you. Well, FAC members, thank you for your time this morning and the opportunity to share with you the information. This is a result of, as Jeff mentioned, several months of very intensive and rigorous work among a very talented consultant team. So the presentation material sort of lays out a narrative. I'll review the ed spec piece, and then I'll review details surrounding each of the 4 options. It will include a description of the options, conversation around construction schedule, phasing, and we will also review the basis of our cost estimates and the total project cost for the 8 scenarios that Jeff was talking about. We've tried to work very hard to use a very clear language and language that is not too industry specific, so it's intended to be digestible by any audience, and would appreciate your feedback on the clarity of the message and such. Jeff also mentioned the staff is providing a recommendation that I'll share toward the end of the material that essentially asks the school board to consider directing staff to begin a concept design and prepare that in conjunction with the next capital improvement plan. So with that, we'll just carry on. The first slide is a demonstration of how the study and this effort has met the board direction that was included at the adoption of the 22 to 24 CIP. So they had asked for 3 options, each at the lowest possible cost. We've provided 4, and in each of those 4, we've created an alternative for a total of 8, and that alternative represents a smaller building and therefore less costly to build. The direction asked us to provide facilities for the existing programs at the ACC. I think it's it's likely fairly familiar to those on this call that there's a lot of deficiencies in their existing building related to program spaces, particularly common areas, and even in some cases classrooms and labs. So we responded to that by developing the educational specifications. We have two versions, a base and an alternative. I'll get in greater detail later, but each of those address this topic completely. The third criteria was to add the maximum number of secondary seats. So our base ed spec does create 450 new secondary seats. The alternative creates no new secondary seats. The next criteria was an athletic field similar to what was proposed in the May 2020 concept. Options 1 through 3 meet this completely. The field is actually identical to the concept in 2020. And then option 4 is a slightly smaller field. And then the next criteria was completing new or renovated space as close to December 2025 as possible. The only option that achieves this criteria is option 4, because that is an option to construct an entirely new facility. All the other options require a more protracted construction schedule because of the sequencing that I'll discuss a little bit later. And the last criteria was including parking to meet expected demand of the various uses on site. So for the sake of consistency, we've used the number approximately 400 parking spaces on site, and that is for all options, and that's being satisfied through through either a above grade parking structure or surface parking, and certainly that will be part of further review and concept design with the transportation study. As far as the ed specs are concerned, here we're comparing the base and the alternative. As I mentioned, the base include 450 new secondary seats, and those as you can see in the planned enrollment row, those consist of 450 Arlington Tech Middle School seats. The common areas are essentially the same between both ed specs. So we achieved a reduction in square footage simply by removing the classroom space and the lab space associated with the 450 seats. The size of the cafeteria, the size of the gym, size of the library, all are consistent among both ed specs, and that's on purpose so that those additional seats could be added at some point in the future easily. The maximum capacity the planned enrollment are the programs listed on the slide. They consist of Arlington Tech Middle School and high school seats, the CTE seats from neighborhood high schools, and that's per period across 3 periods through the day. And then Academic Academy, EL, and PEP. That equates to 1,550 students. The maximum capacity is slightly higher because when we sort of go through the detail of calculating out each individual space based on the planned enrollment, there is a little bit of flexibility built into the capacity. On the alternative ed spec, those numbers are simply reduced by 450 seats represented by the middle school seats. And then the bottom line is showing the square footage required. Since in the alternative ed specs there's less classroom space and lab space to construct, there's a 35,000 square foot difference between the two. The options were developed to provide a variety of solutions on the site, both from the character of those building massing, and then also a variety of cost range. Option 1 tried to minimize the number of additions to the existing building in an attempt to simplify construction and reduce costs. The consequence of that, or the result of this, is it's the largest building footprint, and it creates the greatest travel distances within the building. Option 2 is similar to option 1, but it includes 2 additions to the existing building, and that was a slight modification to option 1 in an attempt to make a more compact building footprint. Option 3, for those who were involved or are familiar with the 2020 concept study, you'll see some similarities. It's essentially the same from a massing perspective. There's a large addition on the along 9th Street, and the sort of a distinguishing feature of this option is the existing Fenwick building can actually stay in place. That building or that site area could be used for something else. And then option 4 is a new build option. For those who are familiar with the materials discussed in the spring, as part of the current CIP approval process, it considers it an entirely new building, and as a result of that, it delivers the space before any other option. And sort of a consequence of this option is most of the existing ACC building or the site area remains for other uses. The field, as mentioned previously, is a bit smaller on this option. So the next 3 slides go through just some illustrations comparing each of the options all in the same slide. In option 1, as mentioned, there's a large addition along Walter Reed. This is Walter Reed here. Highland is along here, and then 9th Street is to the left in the image, and 7th Street is to the right. So all the options involve some kind of parking structure, concentrated at the intersection of 9th and Highland. So in option 1, this addition is along Walter Reed. We have a couple of surface parking lots, one along Walter Reed, one along Highland, and the gray tone in the image is the existing Career Center building. The darker gray tone is the footprint of the Arlington Public Library. And an important comment between both options 1 and 2, the library does present some complications around its presence. It's sort of right in the middle of the school facility in both of those 2 options. The areas in dotted red are the areas of the existing Career Center building that get demolished as part of it. All options require some sort of demolition, but the extent of that demolition ranges a little bit between the options. On option 2, there's a large addition along Walter Reed, but its footprint is smaller than in option 1 because some of that space is created by putting an addition on Highland. Very similar level of demolition to the existing Career Center building, and then a above grade parking structure. And the sort of the rationale between the number of parking spaces in that parking structure, we have 2 versions, one that's about 250 spaces, one that's 400. And the thought behind the 250 was some of it was a cost mitigating measure because that's less expensive to build, or more expensive to build, sorry, than a surface lot. But also it could be that if the parking demands change throughout the years, it would be a lot easier to convert surface parking back to field space or open space or something else than it would be to convert a parking structure back to it. On option 3, the major addition is along 9th Street, directly adjacent to the new parking structure with a smaller addition on Highland. Again, very similar to the concept that was presented in 2020. And then option 4, this will look very familiar to one that was considered as part of the spring discussions. It's an entirely new building along Walter Reed. And then in this case, a larger parking structure is created because the footprint of the new building takes away the opportunity to provide a lot of surface parking without having other consequences like taking away open space. These the next two slides are massing views. It's just sort of a general description of what the building could look like. In this case, it's a view from Walter Reed. In all cases, we're looking at the major addition is a 4 to 5 levels. You know, that the massing will certainly change and evolve as a concept plan is developed, but these are intended so just a general configuration of how this could be achieved. An important distinction is the massing here is based on the larger building, so the 260,000 square foot, representing what that ultimate build out would look like, and certainly if the smaller scale facility was selected, the massing would certainly change. So the footprint could get smaller, the number of levels could change accordingly. And then this view is from Highland. Similarly, the new construction are identified in the white boxes, and then the existing buildings are in the gray boxes. Related to the project schedule, so making the assumption that the board asks us to start concept design with its vote on the 28th of October, we would spend November and December sort of getting ourselves geared up for that. We would develop the scope, negotiate a fee with the architecture and design team, and then we would also start looking at updates to the multimodal transportation analysis that was prepared in 2020 so that it could be consistent with the new project criteria. We would expect the design phase in its entirety to last about 2 years. That's about as quick as we've been able to get from start of concept to shovel on the ground on a capital job. Certainly we would make efforts to try to get there sooner, but to be conservative and be realistic, that was the time period selected. And then construction, the duration of construction varies pretty significantly between the options. The completion dates for each of the options are listed sort of on the slide from soonest to latest. Option 4 delivers everything by April of 27. Options 1 and 2 are December of 27. And then option 3 carries out into August of 28. Those construction durations are based on essentially how many phases are necessary to complete. And within each option, different pieces of the projects are going to be completing at different periods of time, and it can get quite complex. So the chart here is intended to just roughly tell you the approximate sequence for major portions of work. So in option 1, we would construct the Walter Reed addition first. We would then move occupants of the existing Career Center building into that new addition, so that the existing space could be vacant for renovations. And then ultimately, once some of those spaces could be vacated or renovated, we would be able to do the necessary demolition required for the parking structure. And then the last bits and pieces are generally the field and the remaining site work. Option number 2 is similar. We would construct the Walter Reed addition first, move some of the occupants of the existing building into that facility, and then have some ability to begin the Highland addition, followed by other renovations of the existing Career Center, and ultimately the parking structure followed by the field and the site work. On option 3, we would start things a little bit differently because of the significance of that intervention. So it would be the Highland addition first. We would have to vacate some of the Arlington Career Center so that the pieces of it could be demolished so that we could start the 9th Street addition, and then followed ultimately by renovating the Career Center with the field and the site work to sort of follow at the end. Option 3 is the longest schedule because it requires the most complexity of moving pieces. Some of the occupants move multiple times to different areas, and it also is the option that involves the heaviest and most intensive use of temporary classrooms to facilitate some of the renovations. And then option 4 is a sort of a much more straightforward sequence of work. We would essentially build the new structure, move all occupants of the existing building into that structure, and then we could pursue the partial demolition of the existing career center to construct the parking garage, followed by the field and the site work. So to identify our expected project costs, we followed a regimented and disciplined process that we use for all of our capital planning efforts. So it started out with a design team developing narratives, illustrations, descriptions to basically capture what's expected to be entirely the scope of work. We then had that document estimated by 2 estimating groups. One is a professional cost estimator, and then one is a construction manager. Those 2 estimates were shared with everyone, and then we had several discussions across a few weeks to reconcile them. And that process involves, making sure each estimator understands the scope of work and is using their, is based on the same assumptions. The estimates presented are in current dollars, and then at the end we add an escalation factor based on the expected construction duration. And an important distinction, so the alternative ed spec estimates are all less expensive than its counterpart, its base ed spec counterpart. That's reasonable because we're constructing less square footage. Everything else within that estimate is consistent between the 2, so all the site work, all the parking, all of those things are considered to be similar or similar enough that we, at this stage of planning, they should remain unchanged. And then as we sort of discussed different options of presenting this information, we just determined to take an average of each of the two estimates. The estimates, the final estimates between both groups were very close to one another. They're within 2 to 4% on each of the 8 scenarios. So they were, relatively very close proximity to each other. So here is basically a glossary of what is included in each of the type of project cost. These terms are going to be used on the next slide to kind of describe the cost estimates. And so it begins with the construction cost, which represents about 66 to 69% of the total project cost. And this is fairly self-explanatory. It's what the estimators expect the scope of work to cost in current dollars. The construction contingency is about 3 to 5%, and it's a factor that we always have in our estimates to account for changes that are likely to occur during construction. And that percentage varies based on the complexity of the work. So the more complex the work, the more risk, and the higher we feel a contingency is warranted. The owner soft cost is the only cost where APS provided it to the estimators directly. It represents 15 to 16% of the total project cost, and this is for all non-construction related things like design fees, construction management fees, permits, furniture, anything to do with utilities, working with utility companies and the such. And that's a percentage markup that we generated from our historical database on what we typically spend for these types of projects. And then at the end, we add an escalation factor, and these estimates, they account for 11 to 13% of the total project cost. And this is reserved exclusively for what we would think changes to the construction market to occur in the coming years. So these projects are expected to be completed expected to be completed many years in advance, several years in advance. So our escalation factor is a way to mitigate the risk of things changing from now until we actually bid the job. So the top chart explained the estimated total project cost for the base ed spec. That ed spec is the 260,000 square foot facility that has the 1795 maximum capacity. In the range of cost are from about 155 million to 175 million, with option 1 being the least expensive and option 3 being the most expensive. The bottom charts show the alternative ed spec scenarios, which is a smaller facility and a smaller capacity. And similarly, those ranged from 139 million to 158 million, with the option 1 being the least expensive, option 3 being the most expensive. We've identified the construction cost, the construction contingency, the owner cost, and the escalation for each of the 8 scenarios, just for complete disclosure of how we arrived at the total project cost. So in summary, options 1 through 3 will have a minimum of 5 construction phases. It's not impossible to do, but it's definitely will take more time and it's more complexity, because we will have to shift students and teachers from one area to the others to make space available for those renovations within the existing building. Option number 4 is much less complicated from a phasing perspective. We would have expected to have 3 phases there. In options 1 through 3, we will definitely have construction right next to students and teachers learning. It's not a deal breaker. We do these things. It's not unusual for us to pursue this kind of work. In option 4, there will be no occupants in any kind of construction zone, because we would be able to completely isolate the construction site from both the existing Career Center and the Montessori school. So the time period for when new space and new seats is done varies between the option, and it's always sooner than the total the date when the construction phases are complete. So if you're looking at it from just the perspective, when will the entire project have all its square footage renovated or fully constructed new? That would be the line you would look at. So in options 1 and 2, that date is August of 27. Option 3, it's December of 27, and then option 4 is December of 25. Much sooner than any of the other options for the reasons explained previously. And then all construction is complete at a variety of periods of time, as mentioned previously also. And that's to summarize the cost is presented on the previous slide, just shown in a little different way. There's about $18 million savings in the smaller facility, and that's pretty consistent among all options. So, and then related to flex space, options 1 and 2, don't really have any opportunities for flex space, because it's essentially, maximizing the use of the existing building for this program in this capital project. Option 3, the Fenwick site or building becomes available for some other use that's outside of this capital project, this effort. And then in option 4, most of the existing ACC building or site area remain available for some other use. Related to project funding, so based on the currently approved CIP, there's already just over $30 million set aside for this project, which and that means any other project funding would come from future bonds and possibly the capital reserve. So, when reviewing CIP scenarios in the spring, That it needs to be recognized that there's already $30 million assigned to this project, which would need to essentially be deducted from a total project cost that's represented in a CIP chart. So our preferred option, based on consideration of lots of different factors, is option 4. And we feel like it's a new building, and it provides the best opportunity to fully integrate the learning experience and then support the existing school culture. And we did have a conversation with Margaret Chung on this, and she concurs certainly with this recommendation, and in particular that bullet point. It offers the earliest completion date for new seats and site facilities. It will certainly be, by far the least disruptive to ongoing school instruction and functions for the programs on the site. It represents the lowest level of project complexity, and that is important because it's the most predictable from a cost perspective and a risk perspective, and it maximizes the flexibility for long-term site use. As mentioned, it essentially frees up most of the existing Career Center building to be able to use for some other function or some other future site redevelopment. Provides a lot of opportunities there in the long term. And based on the current financial outlook, it's very reasonable and very likely that this project funding could be accommodated within the CIP that will be deliberated in the spring. So based on that, it is staff's recommendation that the board approve both the base ed spec and the alternative ed spec, and that we use option 4 and the project requirements that are listed on the screen here to start work on the concept design. And the project requirements are essentially our instructions to staff to kind of give us the boundaries, so to speak, on what the project must achieve and is intended to achieve. So that addresses capacity, the instructional programs, the project cost, the nature of the facilities, the approximate location of those facilities on the site, the building size, and then the completion year. And what we would also ask the school board to do is, develop a concept design and estimate based on the base ed spec, and a separate concept design and cost estimate based on the alternative ed spec, designed to accommodate a future addition. So we feel this is a prudent approach, given the status of the financial and the enrollment uncertainties that exist. If we study this scenario both ways and present both ways to the board in the spring, and concurrently with the CIP document, that will enable the board at a concept level design approval period to select from those options for us to proceed. And I believe that concludes the presentation piece, and happy to field any questions or take some comments.
Hey Ben, this is Dave Goodman.
Yeah,
I've got a bunch of questions. Not necessarily a critique, but really more for information. If you could help me with this.
of course.
As you were going along, you mentioned 400. Was it 450 parking spaces or 400 parking spaces?
400.
Bigger.
It's 400, David.
400. What's that parking ratio turn out to be? Do you know?
You mean related to just parking per expected staff member? Or?
Yeah, the per person, per staff parking. I'm assuming most of it's staff parking, not student parking, or is there student parking in there too?
So there would be there's no student parking assumed in that.
Okay.
So in our efforts in the concept phase in 2020, we produced a draft MMTA that identified expected parking demand for the site. At that time, it identified a sort of a peak demand of 450 cars. That considered a site that had Arlington Community High School remaining, and it also considered a site where the Career Center building would be supporting an additional 800 seats rather than 450 seats. So for planning purposes, we felt like 400 on-site was an appropriate number until we had an opportunity to kind of refine that MMTA and get a better parking demand estimate.
Yeah, David, that'll be refined as we would move into a concept design, because we would be involving the ELPC and PFRC as we had before, and county would be fully involved with regard to that. And I think in the 2020 study and work that we had done, the county actually wanted significantly less parking. APS was fighting for more parking due to the issues we were having with Fleet and Thomas Jefferson, as well as the Heights building with regard to issues with parking with staff. So we actually were arguing for more parking than the county was. The county initially wanted us to provide no parking, but I don't think that is really doable for APS based on our experience. So we wanted to be conservative at this point for the study. It can by sure get smaller. I don't think it's going to have to get larger for what we're doing there. And if somewhere down the road, Montessori Public School of Arlington would be relocated somewhere down the road, again, the parking demand should be a little bit less. But I think we also are thinking in terms of accommodating any future work at this site. Again, as we noted, the existing facility could remain. It could be replaced somewhere down the road with a larger facility, that kind of thing. So we aren't planning that at this point. We have to plan the site for the completion of this work and that accommodation.
Okay. Well, if you could at some point maybe send along the parking assumptions, that would be helpful. Also, just for my edification, because I'm still learning, what's the academic academy? You mentioned there's a slide earlier. You mentioned the academic academy, EL, and PEP. What are those? I'm not as familiar with the program as you guys are.
There are existing programs within the Career Center that are all under the principal's purview.
Okay, so I'd have to dig into that.
Yeah, David, those are kind of specialty programs
Right.
that are concentrated at the Career Center building, and they have been for many years. I'm sure there's a good description somewhere online. I wouldn't do it justice. I know that some of our earlier documents do have very clear definitions on what those programs, what they do.
Yeah, this is like homework for me. I got to learn about all the different program elements that we're trying to incorporate here.
If you go to the Career Center webpage while you're looking this weekend, under About Us, I believe all the programs are defined in that area.
Okay.
And I also think, it was all taken into account in the ed spec, because basically we are reacting to the educational specification.
Oh, right. And the ed spec, is that something that the FAC has already looked at, or?
No, it will be made available.
Okay.
Again, the board will be looking at that as part of this process on the 14th and 28th.
Yeah, right. So you guys are just responding to the ed spec, and I'm asking. Like to look at that, dig into that when it's available. Another question. Tell me a little bit about the library, and does it have any special status? Can it be incorporated into the program? Is there a reason why we're trying to leave it untouched?
There have been studies done. There was a white paper done on trying to combine school and county library facilities, and it does not work because of the two missions are completely different. And there's privacy issues, et cetera, that we have to monitor at APS, and protecting the students that they cannot enforce the public library.
So is this like lessons learned from the Westover experience?
Well, this particular site, David, I brought the options back, but the darker gray is sort of the area of the library.
Yeah.
And and historically it has been there for decades, and it's sort of on the corner, and it used to occupy both the first floor and the second floor of that basically footprint, that area. We very recently completed an entire renovation of that library facility to consolidate it from 2 floors to 1 floor. And the second floor actually became sort of a shared space that Arlington Tech uses during the school day for instructional purposes. And our agreement with the county right now, we have a lease agreement that they will stay until they choose to move. I know that the public library does have an interest in relocating at some point if a space became available and it made sense to them. But they we're the direction given to us is we are to host them until they choose to leave.
I wonder if maybe we could encourage them to leave in some way. I'm just wondering, does having that piece, right in the middle of your site make it onerously difficult to work with, or is it just a minor inconvenience? Would there be some motivation to find a alternate arrangement? With all the new development going on at Columbia Pike, I gotta think that there's going to be an opportunity to find a new location for the library if it's better than what they have today.
I think there's probably about a decade of information that this has been discussed. So you can do some research on that one as well.
God, I don't want to. I just want you to tell me.
I think from an operational perspective, David, it's not a big inconvenience the way it exists today. I think in the options that we're presenting, it does present some challenges in options 1 and 2 because it essentially separates the existing building from the new construction. So that is a consideration for those
and the renovations that we did, David, are intended that if the library should leave, it would be usable by APS with very minimal work, basically putting sprinklers in.
Interesting. Is it historically designated or anything?
No.
Not that I know of, no.
Okay.
I don't think it's got a brutalist designation for that architecture.
Last question. You mentioned the Fenwick building, being able to keep it on site. Could you point out for me which one is the Fenwick?
It's the building that Arlington Community High School currently occupies.
Sorry, right there. Yeah. Awesome.
Yeah. It's sorry, we have different names for things sometimes, and Fenwick is what it's been called historically, but it's where Community High School currently exists.
It used to be a county medical building, and it was adapted after the county left it and Community High School moved into it. It's not an ideal educational space because it's really offices. So it's never really been a great learning space, but it was used because it was available.
That was actually going to be my follow-up question. Is how useful is it in keeping it? Does it have any what's its flexibility, or is it kind of rigid? And
it's a poured-in-place concrete structure like everything else, and it's just, if you look at it on the plan in comparison to Montessori Public School and the Career Center building, it's tiny.
Yeah,
and it very much limits the site use,
Correct.
because it really ends up defining, where you can come in and out of the site with your drive aisles. So losing it allows so much more flexibility, and all of these other options kind of can come into play because of it not being there.
Yeah.
Right. And I think if you look at what happened in 2020 and you look at option 3, and the reason why it's more expensive is because you're working around that building,
Right.
and leaving it there, so it reduces the amount of site available to use. The other 3 options, take advantage of that. And that was one of the things that helped us move forward with the project, was looking at that option.
Yeah.
It is
Yeah, it makes sense.
to continue to look at that, because the one thing that option 3 gives us is it gives us a more unified building,
Mhm.
from an educational program, and that was what our ultimate goal is. So it's not only a physical building, it's how does it work as a school.
Yeah. Yeah. Although site circulation wise, taking over that space by expanding through the surface parking lot or modifying the other, it does sort of restrict access to the site. But I don't know if there's ever been, like if you take those 2 access points and consolidate them into one, does it make site circulation, any more challenging, or is it maybe it's a neutral issue? I don't know. I was just sort of thinking about site layout. But you're right, the existing structure itself is probably, there'd be no great sadness over losing the structure. And it does give you more flexibility. Can I ask a question about the Montessori school? I know it's not part of the program here. But at other times at FAC meetings, we have talked about, using the entire site. And so why is that not on the table right now?
Budget and
Okay.
space needs.
Right.
I think that the hope is down the road. It's one of our smallest schools. It's got some physical challenges and HVAC challenges. And somewhere down the road, it would probably be appropriate to move it, which would allow, this site to be further developed with a larger field, et cetera. I don't think, based on the Career Center Working Group, we would be looking at building a building there. It would be open space towards the community, towards the residential areas. So I think that that's one of the comments that we make in the our recommendation is it gives us the most flexibility for the site in the future.
Right.
Utilizing the building for another purpose somewhere down the road, a couple, 3, 4 years from now, we'll find a use. It is an occupied building that is physically fine. So it can be used, and we have other needs, and FAC can think about that and talk about that as we would move forward. But we don't have the budget to do anything with that at this point in time. But I can probably come up with 3 or 4 options, including, future expansion on this site. For a larger high school, if we need additional high school seats in the future, you could have a high school component added. That could be multiple stories, just like the original concept was in 2020.
Okay. So in previous FAC meetings, maybe even the very last FAC meeting, there was a lot of talk about expanding the Montessori program, and maybe I seem to remember somebody had a keen interest in expanding the Montessori Montessori program on site, and there were a lot of questions about whether that was actually needed or wanted. I remember there was a lot of discussion about, where's somebody provide the justification, the numbers for why that was necessary.
Jeff, I'll jump in. I can jump in if you don't mind. The IPP, or the Instructional Program Pathways work, was going on last year.
Yeah.
And one of the early pieces that came out of that was a K-8 or a pre-K-8 Montessori school, combining all of it in one place.
Right.
It's one of the first recommendations we have. And so it was the easiest to go to, just as we were looking at it. I believe we'll see more, the immersion visioning process is going on, and I believe they're going to make a similar recommendation. So as that vision, long-term vision takes shape, and it's going to be a slow process to do that, I imagine we'll identify other needs as well.
Yeah. But
that was the most readily available. That was the loud and clear, one of the loud and clear recommendations that came out of the first wave of the work.
Okay. But this plan doesn't really anticipate being able to grow the Montessori program on that site. So you're thinking if it does grow, it needs to grow someplace else?
Well, our study, David, was in response to the board's direction. So we were charged with creating a new Career Center facility.
Right.
And so that's what this study focuses on. And, because this site has had quite a long history on, studies and options and considerations. And part of the concern during the spring, when we did the studies, we tried to do both. We tried to meet both the Arlington Career Center objective plus some Montessori objective. And as Jeff mentioned, it just became too cost prohibitive because in total that was upwards of $260 million.
That's right. Okay. All right. So addressing the Montessori needs again, if it's gonna come up, somebody's gonna say, hey, whatever happened to the Montessori program needs APS's staff's response is that's another study for another time and possibly a different.
Yeah, we've never guaranteed we're going to do what's being recommended in the IPP. The idea is if we have sort of the needs identified, as space becomes available, we can look at those to see if any of them make sense. But right now, even with Montessori they added another class this year, but they had to fit within the physical building. So they actually repurposed another room to get the capacity, get the enrollment level that they had this year. So, we don't want to add relocatables on that site to expand Montessori. There really isn't the space to do it there.
Yeah. No, I'm just thinking about, if you guys forge ahead, let's say everybody agrees that option 4 makes the most sense for all the reasons that you laid out. Is somebody going to come out of the woodwork and say, hey, but what about the Montessori program? You're not thinking about our needs. Like, how do you respond to that?
Everybody does that, and this is focused on the Career Center.
Yeah, I know.
Well, and I think the other thing to look at is enrollment projections and the space capacities, and there's a lot of that in the air. And the board, it was one of the directions. They really want to take care of the issues and problems at the Career Center.
Yeah.
And if the two issues that they brought up at the work session was, number one, what will enrollment be? Do we really need additional space? We don't know that yet.
Yeah.
There's still too many unknowns, and then budget. We really don't know what the dollars are available. And it is constantly changing. Though it has just recently gotten better than we had numbers for at the work session. So I think the answer to the question is it's something that will have to be addressed as we move forward, but it's not what we are addressing right now.
Can I? That's one way of dancing around it. No, I'm just thinking devil's advocate, right? Somebody says, well, gosh, guys, you're trying to optimize this site, for the Career Center, and yet here's the Montessori program that has a need. Why not incorporate it into your program, and that way you can come up with possibly even more efficient use of the site by mixing it into your scope. Aside from the fact that we know that it's just too prohibitively expensive right now, is that basically the answer? Is we say, we just can't afford to think of you right now, so we're just going to put a dotted line around it?
Well, David, I don't think we've said no. This is just the first step. We were taking too big of a bite, and we're taking the first nibble, and then the next, the board will decide where the next step is.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, I think also as a parent of a Montessori kid, I don't necessarily feel like I have skin in the game in terms of, whatever, but in general, the Montessori is very pleased to be in their own building right now. I don't think that you'll get a lot of cries of, well, why did we not get incorporated elsewhere? I think the fact that the Montessori is staying in place on each of these options is what's going to make Montessori happy, because they just now got their own building. They've been in other buildings with other programs, and they feel really great about being independent. They're very proud of that fact. So, so I think that's kind of a non-issue.
Okay.
And from the BLPC, I think their bigger issue when they would raise it was, there was some conversations about well, what if we just, get rid of this space or get, basically eating into the Montessori's domain. And that was more of their issues than wanting a new building at this time, because they're happy to be they're happy to be there.
Yeah, I think as we go forward, there's going to be more possibilities, and we have to pick the best possibility for Montessori, not just utilizing a space because it's there.
Because it's
Yep.
there, right. No, I would agree with that too. That's the smartest. That's probably the smartest response to have right now.
I think
Um,
my big question though is with the alternate ed specs, the minus 450 seats, or I've had the numbers written down, but is the goal then, because that's 4 options. I mean, so each of these, I guess the big question is there 4 options or is there 8 options on the table? Is there the 4 options with the original base ed specs and then the 4 options with the alternate, smaller ed specs, or is what's being presented only the revised alternate ed specs?
No, I think there are 4 options for each of the ed specs. I mean, the ed specs
Okay.
are really the same, except for we took out the additional
Yep.
additional classrooms, not everything else.
Yep.
And the intent is that with the alternative ed spec is we are still going to design this building essentially as if it would be getting those 450 seats, but the board will have the opportunity to say to build them or not build them now. They can be built in the future. So
Right, I see.
it's not, and we will, when we work through the concept, the intent is that we create a design that allows them to be, quote, easily added, whether it would be a new floor, whether it would be the end of the building. I mean, it would
Yep.
change how we currently lay out a building, but it would be designed that it would be added that it would just be an additive construction process, not tearing things down, not making major modifications. The space would be there, the connections would be there, etc.
Okay, thank you.
Rebecca, it looks like you have a question.
Once again, I'm just,
Thank you for
waiting. So
patiently
yeah.
waiting. Yeah.
No, those are all, again, good questions. So one of my first questions, we kind of alluded to it a little bit, but first of all, I have a son that goes there. So I will say that it's already extremely challenging site and the parking lot's very dangerous as it is today. So I think option 4, I think for my son will be out by then, but I do think the least disruptive, obviously, for these kids, the better. But one of the things with option 4, that Highland Street, do you anticipate or see a risk in the transportation study if you basically backload or load all of the ingress and egress onto Highland? Do you see any, any potential transportation study risk with that?
I think it's a good.
Go ahead.
I think it's a good question, Rebecca. We do maintain an access on Walter Reed and in option 4 as well, sort of in between the existing building and where community high school exists. So not everything is occurring off of Highland, and our entrance to the parking structure is always off of 9th Street, not off of Highland. We're very conscious of the impacts of that on that street in particular, and we know even now operationally it's a challenging street with the Montessori program there and all the functions coexisting. So I don't think it's a deal breaker of that option. I think it's something that we'll have to be carefully studied with our team to make sure that we present and produce something that is as safe and sort of reasonable as possible.
And that would integrate the Montessori bus routing, pickup route, all that kind of stuff too.
Absolutely,
so full transportation plan. Yeah,
I mean, we would have to, just like we did in 2020, we would have to identify pickup drop-off for buses and parents for every function at the site. And I will say that when, at that time, community high school was staying and we had more seats in the Career Center building. So the overall traffic demand and impacts were likely higher when we studied it in 2020 than they would be in these conditions. Just sort of as an intuitive reasoning. And so I think that we were able to satisfy a lot of those functions, maybe not completely in 2020. So with these conditions here, I think that it would be something similar.
Yes, it's something that will definitely be explored and worked through as we do the concept. The county also, with their Complete Streets program on Walter Reed, wants fewer entrances and exits on Walter Reed. Again, we have to work through that with them, with the main entrance in option 4 being on Walter Reed. One of the things that we have identified is that all of our buildings require handicap parking, unloading and loading at the front door of all of our buildings. So that will all have to be worked through with them. So yeah, there's a lot of conversations, but I think, if you look at option 1, it's all off of Highland and then the parking structure off of 9th. I think that's a worse situation than option 4. But again, we'll have to work through that. That's all going to be developed. We're in the process of getting ready to do more parking or traffic study because we need to have that information as we move into the BLPC PFRC process.
Yeah, no, great. Thank you. And then my kind of the second piece from an educational instruction perspective, the CTE courses, because my big focus is those are so specialized, automotive, animal sciences, some of those spaces are so specialized. And if we don't get it right at the Career Center, we're not going to do it at Yorktown. We're not going to do it at, we're not going to recreate those spaces. So is this 300, is that what we serve now? So are we adding no additional capacity for CTE?
We are actually adding capacity because we are providing CTE spaces for Arlington Tech in addition to the 300. So we are actually looking at more spaces.
Okay.
And again, that's all part of the educational specifications, and that was all heavily looked at as we worked through that. And again, we will continue to work through that as we move forward. But we are going to be looking at state-of-the-art facilities rather than spaces that are oversized and underutilized. So, we're going to be more efficient. It's going to be like academies at Loudon type labs, if you've ever seen that facility. But it's going to be more appropriate for the programs that are taught today rather than the programs that were taught in 1978.
Yeah, well, because that,
Can I add, Chris Martini is also taking a look at how this works countywide, across schools, and then also the 2-period configurations and how virtual actually might expand CTE access. Maybe the kid only goes to the Career Center for 1 day, but does all of their classes there. So on their lab days, they're there. So they're really looking at how do we align all of the schedules and work to open up more CTE as well.
Thank you, Lisa. Yeah. That's a good point.
Yeah, and that's kind of because, right now 900, if that's 10, 12%, of our total, the high school population. And I do think that's a growing instructional need across the county. So I just want to make sure, and in the new building, so a follow-up to that is, given it's going to be kind of, I guess, parking lot, street locked. I'm assuming, again, these, I'm sure in the ed specs and stuff, but like our animal sciences program, is there space? We've got a little paddock, I don't know what you call it, outside the Career Center now for, the animals. So, I mean, all of that, like if you built this whole new building, is there space, like outdoor space for the animals?
They're
things
actually
like that?
working that entire program and not going to require a paddock. They're going to be more, they're working, Chris Martini, we're not doing it, but they're reworking the entire program. And I think all of the programs are being looked at, and they're going to be, as I said, state of the art for current today. And the spaces we are creating are going to be flexible spaces. These labs can change. So if they decide they're not going to offer this anymore because it's not needed, or that technology doesn't exist, or there's a new technology that they need to train kids for, they're going to be able to much more readily modify these labs that we're creating.
Great, because that's when you talk about flex space. I know we need full-time seats, but that's awesome that that we're thinking about too, that we can use flex space to grow and allow more access to high school, other high school kids to come there. And then my last question, just because I am now intimately familiar with the phase 2 at the Heights building, so in the option number 4, is that a similar, would that potentially, I know people aren't real thrilled with the Heights thing right now, but would that potentially be something similar that if we did, the option 4, and then given you have, basically the current Career Center building that will be available to, for other uses, could that potentially be a larger field in like a phase 2 versus the, the smaller field in the middle, or, that or later or something? Could that potentially be a more of a full-size field where the current Career Center building is?
It could be. We aren't identifying that, but yes, it's space that's available for future use, whether it's a field space, a building space, or reusing the existing building as is. That we're not identifying at this point in time.
Rebecca, I think this plays into that renovation work. When we saw those studies last year, the Career Center building's actually a pretty sturdy building, but the Montessori building is not. So that's part of when we look at that renovation schedule, that might play into what you might repurpose on the site over the long term as we find other spaces.
Yeah.
Gotcha.
Yeah, I think the one comment that I made up front is that the building is actually occupied and usable. It's usable for a secondary program. We were trying to put an elementary program in there, which required a lot of work to that building because of toilets, et cetera, for kindergarten, pre-K, kindergarten, and first grade, which is our standard. So there was a lot of additional work that has to be done to turn that into an elementary facility versus a secondary facility. So the only space that is missing for utilizing that as a full-time school facility is what's missing right now for the Career Center, which is a gymnasium of some sort. So that would have to be something that would be added if you would use it as a school. But there's a commercial kitchen already there. So all you have to do is create the cafeteria. So there's a lot of uses that could be done cost effectively. The moving Montessori there was not as cost effective as we had hoped it to be when we put it in as part of the option to study.
All right, that was it. Thank you.
And Rebecca, for your comment, and David's also on the ed spec, just to give you some commentary when you do have a look at that document. Essentially it's can be considered a space program, in AE speak. And it identifies, it's intended to identify every space within the building that's required. And that really is our foundation for developing these massings and, determining how much square footage is required. So those spaces are organized by typical classroom spaces. They're organized by technical areas. So you'll be able to see how many auto labs, how many culinary labs, all of that is itemized and identified. All common areas like the size of the gymnasium, cafeteria, kitchen, library, all of it is, all that it's itemized. There's two categories of spaces, those that add capacity to the building and those that don't. So there's columns associated with that. It tells you, our assumptions for utilization rate, teaching to teacher to student ratios, because they differ depending on the programs at the site. So all that data is there and available for use, and then it essentially summarizes up to a total program area, and then we add a 40% factor for circulation and such. So that's how it spits out the the expected gross square footage.
Guys, I know we're going over, but I did have one nagging question about the parking structure. I know that building parking garages is ridiculously expensive, and Arlington County has, policies to discourage any additional parking and that kind of stuff. So, I'm sure that you guys are not eager to build a parking garage that's any bigger than it actually necessarily has to be. But could we, if the parking structure, particularly the larger one, right, the 400 space parking structure, stays in the program, I would encourage us to look into creative fund, both capital funding and operational funding of the parking structure. You know, it's so close to all the businesses along Columbia Pike. You got to think that, you know, there could be some kind of cost sharing arrangement or making it flexible for future use, you know, particularly on the weekends and things when maybe when schools don't need them. I would just really hate to see us put a lot of money into a parking structure and then for it to be, you know, entirely unused for, you know, at least 2 days out of the week. And then, you know, and then find, you know, evening needs that are being unmet and that kind of a thing. So, you know, it's just a general statement, I guess, about parking garages.
Yeah, David, we've learned a lot about parking structures, and no, I don't want to operate or own a parking structure as APS because it's not only expensive to build, they're expensive to maintain.
Yeah.
One of the things is that we cannot charge for parking. That was something that was determined when we did the fleet parking structure. But it is open, it is used by the neighborhood and the community weekends and evenings. It's open till 11 o'clock at night, and it's closed from 11 till 5:30 a.m. I believe it is. But it's open parking.
Why are you not allowed to charge?
You can't charge taxpayers for something they paid for.
We do it at the pool. We've got a brand new facility down in Potomac Yard with we can't charge people to use the parking structures. That's
you
ridiculous.
know, the Ballston garage was actually a bond funded one, so they do, but they had to get it into the bond language. It's really sort of a complicated issue.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah. No, it's something that we haven't talked about or considered in previous parking structures, but yes, it is an issue.
All right.
And again,
keep on it.
we're going to have to work through this with the as we work through the concept design, and the county's going to weigh in, and you know we have to weigh in, and we'll have to figure out, you know, is it 400, is it 250, is it 350, is it, you know, what is it? You know, maybe a developer comes in and as part of what they're going to build at a, you know, block away, that they're going to provide community benefit of parking structure for schools. I can't say any of that, and we can't comment on any of that, but you know, you can always dream, right?
Well, at least let's keep our ears open for creative solutions. Yeah.
Yeah. This is Rosa. I had a couple comments. Because originally you also said if we had comments on the presentation. So I just had some short ones. I guess being a visual person, I would have liked to have seen sort of this slide earlier in the presentation, but that's just, you know, I don't know that is necessary, but that was just me because I'm very visual, so I kind of understand the 4 options based on this plan diagram, or, you know, quickly understand their differences and what they're doing. So that was also like, you know, I think the slide before this, maybe you could switch those two at least, you know, so that basically, you know, you're kind of, here's the presentation and then get into the detail and then maybe show them again so that you can clearly understand them. But
you know what you could do actually, because that's a really excellent idea. I was thinking if you could take those graphics and turn them into little thumbnails.
Yes, that was my next comment.
Yeah, stick them alongside all the other spreadsheets.
Once you start to break down the options, once you have a lot of slides where your option 1 is this, you know, like here's the cost, here's the schedule. It would be nice to kind of get just a little thumbnail of, you know, of one, you know, something so that you can kind of easily go, which was option 1? Oh, it was that.
Tie it back to each one. Exactly.
Yep, exactly. So that was, and then the last thing was on slide 16, you had a, that was the breakdown of the schedule a little bit. And I think if you go forward or like behind 15, if you go to slide 15 real quick, go back one slide, this had the dates on it. So you kind of talked about that and then the differences with the options. But then when you went to 16, it was the breakdown of the phasing by option. But it would be nice to just have a little under each option, just that completion date or something to tie it back into the previous slide. So again, that was hard for me to kind of, remember, like now we're breaking down and talking about it in more detail, but it was hard for me to remember which, options, we're completing when. So those were just my comments on the presentation itself,
Good
but
comments. Thank you.
Thank you. That's a consequence of knowing these options too much.
yeah, right. Yep. Okay. Well, I do have to go though, but I don't know if anybody wants to continue to, talk but thanks for the time. And I guess we'll meet again Monday and we can kind of chew on this, and I'll make sure I send David some additional information as well as whatever's on the BLPC website and the Career Center website. But I have my notes as well in terms of like what the different programs there each do, so.
Yeah, thank you. And so we're meeting on Monday. Are we also meeting on the 25th?
Yeah, I think we're still meeting on both Monday evenings
Okay.
as well. So
Gotcha.
this was more of a preview.
Yeah.
Any major heartache or, comment, but then I think Monday will be, a little bit, I guess, further discussion, but, or maybe that'll be short as well. So.
Alrighty. Well, thank you guys for the presentation. Appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you.
for your input.
And for the time to ask questions. That was particularly helpful.
Thanks for your comments and questions. It is appreciated. I mean, you work in a vacuum, and it's nice to have some input. So thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, great.
All right, excellent. See everyone on Monday.
Yep, great.
Michael, Lisa and I may be late depending on weekly meeting.
Okay, that's fine.
Probably not, but you never know.
Okay, all righty. Bye, all.
Hey, I took notes in the slides, and on the very first slide, I just put general comments that I thought you can ignore them, but I just took sort of some of the ideas that they came out there in case you wanted to capture those, and then I took them on the slides that they had.
Oh, and yeah, also I recorded it, I just didn't announce it. So the new feature on Teams, if you go in and you go to the triple more actions, you can look at the transcript and it will show exactly what people said.
Oh, interesting.
So you can go in there
every day.
You can go, yeah. So as I'm speaking, it is transcribing. So you can go back and look and say, oh, David said this, Rosa said that.
So do you want to stop the recording since the meeting's
Robot.
Yeah, well, and that was the other thing too. I will stop the recording, and